Let's see. All right. So I will get started here. Good afternoon and welcome to the Ramsey County Law Library Zoom CLE event for this month. My name is Shannon Stoneking, the Ramsey County Law Library Director. Forgot to turn off my phone. Our CLE presentation today is entitled Shielding the Carer, Understanding the Managing Secondary Trauma in the Legal Profession. And I am so pleased that we have Sarah McGillis here to share her knowledge and expertise about this topic with us. We are also recording it, as I mentioned, as our second possible on-demand event. Looking ahead to next month's CLE in May, that program will be our Law Day event entitled Out of Many, One, and it will be on having and engaging in tough conversations. And the date and time of that program will be a little different than our second Wednesday, so we will be holding that on the first Wednesday, May 7th, and the event will happen between 10:30 and 12. So it's a 1.5 CLE credit, and it will be advertised through the MSBA or RCBA website. I will send out notification about that CLE to the email list at the end of this month. You can also learn about any future CLE that we will post on the Ramsey County Law Library website, as well as on the Ramsey County Bar Association Barristers website. Or you can also contact me directly at the Law Library if you have any additional questions or suggestions about future programs. And on one side note, June 11th, we will have Jill Hasday, who will be speaking to us about her new book that just came out in March, entitled We the Men, How Forgetting Women's Struggles for Equality Perpetuates Inequality. Few housekeeping details. For today, the event is held as a live presentation, and I will be reviewing the recording to see if it can be submitted to be available as an on-demand credit. This will have a different number assigned. As previously mentioned, the program for today, it has been approved for special mental health credit, and the event code number is 524903. This number will be posted in the chat section after the speaker introduction. Other guidelines to keep in mind: questions for the presenter are always appreciated. If you do have those, the speaker has asked that we hold those questions to the end, but you certainly can post them, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation today if there is time. Finally, I don't know if I asked you this, Sarah, can we send out a copy of your materials to the attendees? Is that available?
Of course, yes.
All right, I will be sending out that email later today. Are there any questions about the process? Don't see any hands being raised. So I will introduce our speaker today is Sarah McGillis, who joined Lawyers Concern for Lawyers as an outreach director after embarking on a 27-year career in litigation. Sarah is dedicated to ensuring that attorneys receive robust, targeted support and rapid access to essential services when they are needed. Her background encompasses both civil and criminal defense litigation, as well as administrative matters involving licensed professionals. She was recognized as a super lawyer every year between the years of 2011 and 2024. So I'm sure this year you will be recognized as well. In addition, she previously acted as a federal defender mentor for the District of Minnesota, supervising new federal practitioners involved in criminal defense matters as part of the Criminal Justice Act. She has been an adjunct professor at both Mitchell-Hamlin and the University of Minnesota Law Schools, and also a member of multiple professional boards. And thank you for your attention in these introductory remarks, and it is my pleasure to hand things off to Sarah.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for spending your noon hour with me. I really appreciate it. And I'm talking about something that is very important to me, which is the secondary trauma that we might be exposed to in our roles as lawyers. So for purposes of today, I'm going to talk to you about secondary trauma, what it is, how it shows up in lawyers, what are some of the potential problems that can arise by virtue of our exposure to secondary trauma. And then, of course, we really want to talk about what can we do to put ourselves in the best possible position to hear other people's stories, but still maintain our own well-being. So we are exposed to trauma, secondary and vicarious, by virtue of being exposed to either our client stories or the matter that we're working on. Now, for today, for purposes of today's presentation, I am going to use the term secondary and vicarious trauma interchangeably. Some of the literature makes a distinction between the two, but for our purposes today, we're going to talk about them as if they are one and the same. But before we do that, we have to talk about what is trauma in the first instance. And what you're seeing on the screen is our definition of trauma that is sort of the clinical definition. So it occurs when we've been exposed to a circumstance or a set of circumstances that really overwhelm our ability to cope with those and have some kind of long lasting effect that is harmful to us. When I talk about trauma in sort of a layman's terms, many times I like to harken back to the origin of the word. It's a Greek word that means wound. And so when we talk about trauma, we're talking about a psychic wound. In the first instance, when we're talking about people who are exposed to trauma. So we're going to be talking about secondary and vicarious trauma and how you can potentially be exposed to trauma. I did litigation, so a lot of the exposure that I had to trauma was based on the litigation process. So I tend to look at it through that lens, but there are a number of different ways. Generally, when we're talking about secondary or vicarious trauma, we're talking about being exposed to someone else's trauma ancillary to our job as lawyers, because we're talking about how it affects attorneys. You do not have to work directly with a traumatized individual to have secondary trauma. You can be exposed by virtue of the discovery process, through reports, through recordings, photographs. You can be exposed just by virtue of sitting in on a deposition or some kind of event where someone is testifying about something that's traumatic. And in fact, a very significant amount of the research has been, looking at how are jurors and judges traumatized by virtue of sitting through a trial. And probably the best or most well-known example of that is they studied the jurors who listened to the Boston Marathon bombing. And that was tried in federal court. And as part of, sort of their exposure, listening to that testimony, seeing those photographs of people, those jurors had some pretty significant secondary trauma, so much so that the federal court maintained their status as jurors long after they were done sitting in judgment of those defendants, and in order to allow them to access the federal employment assistance programs, counseling through the federal system to help them cope with what they saw and what they experienced by virtue of sitting in judgment. Now, the more you either interact with a traumatized individual or traumatized material, either you're interacting with them personally or through other sources, the more significant that trauma can be. Now, one of the things whenever I'm talking to lawyers, I'm always talking about, sort of this resistance that we have to this idea that we can be adversely affected by the matters that we're working on. I, for one, was somebody who was like, I can handle this. I am not going to let it show that this is really getting to me. And that is why I especially love this quote by Dr. Rachel Naomi Reman. And she says the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss on a daily basis and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. We are going to get wet, and many of us are immersed in cases in which we are exposed to trauma, the trauma of others. Now, what are some of the signs of secondary traumatic stress at work? So we have the trauma, the secondary trauma itself, and then we have the stress response. That's what we experience. And so there are a number of different things that, we talk about, both in terms of what are the emotions that you're feeling and what are some of the behaviors that you want to be looking out for. So whenever I talk about secondary traumatic stress, we're talking about trauma, a wound. So what do? We avoid. So what you many times you'll see as a result of someone who's working on heavy trauma cases, that might be the case that gets pushed across the desk and is worked on later. Sometimes we're avoiding the clients because the client is sort of the source of that trauma by virtue of telling their stories. And so that might be a client that we're kind of like, oh, I can't work with that client today, because I'm already spread emotionally pretty thin and, I'm just not in the best place. Maybe I start, avoiding certain parts of the discovery, or I'm not looking at it really carefully. It's very common for people to feel on edge, become very hyper vigilant. Because of the exposure to trauma, they might feel like it unsettles their equilibrium in the world. And so, they start seeing things as being potentially troubling or threatening. Again, because when we have a traumatic response, when we're having that stress response by virtue of being exposed to someone's trauma, we can be in fight or flight mode. And when we're in fight or flight mode, we tend to see things as black and white. There's a very clear evolutionary purpose for that, right? We don't want to be contemplating, the ambiguity and the nuances of different situations. If we are trying to run away from a peril, right? So we tend to think of things in black and white. We can become combative, defensive, or argumentative. And sometimes we shut down and we numb out. We avoid other people. Alcohol and drugs are very common coping mechanisms to deal with trauma. When we talk about secondary traumatic stress at home, that stress response at home, what we tend to see is more of it occurring within our bodies. So there's something about, that being at home that it tends to show up more in our bodies. So many times you'll have sleep disturbances. You might be awake at night, like a wide awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, wondering like, why am I obsessing over the details of this particular case? Or they might be particularly troubling to you in the middle of the night when your defenses are lower. Many people end up with stress within their body. So headaches, stomach aches, back pain, neck pain, anxiety is very common. And that is sort of, again, a lot of times comes hand in hand with sleep disturbances. So we might be wide awake at night, thinking through things in a way that is really not very effective, but that is a sign that our brains are trying to work out this very emotional thing. Many times we see, again, that hypervigilance, irritability. We might snap a little bit more quickly because, again, we're spread really thin. I can give you an example of that hypervigilance in one of the cases that I defended. In a particular case that I defended, there was a car accident that involved the death of a child. And at that time, I had a child who was right about the same age as the child who had died in this particular case. And so all of a sudden, I became like super aware of how people drive on the highway. And I felt very vulnerable when I was carting my kids around, thinking like, life is very tenuous, in a way that probably did not necessarily comport with reality, but was a result of the case that I was working on at the time. Again, excessive worry. One of the other things that we see, this will surprise probably no one. Again, we see the use of different kinds of chemicals to cope or different kinds of things to cope. So, I leave it up to you to make a determination as to whether or not your use of, for example, Netflix binges or Haagen-Dazs ice cream is unhealthy. But I do want to put it on your radar screen that using drinking or substances or food to numb or tamp down that stress response is common, but it's probably something that you might want to consider, like, is this an effective way long term for me to deal with the stress that I'm feeling? So there are a number of different factors that put you at higher risk for having a very significant stress response when you're exposed to the trauma of another person. And the first is, do you have a personal history of trauma? Is there something in your history that could trigger you? So sometimes it's something that didn't happen, not necessarily something that did happen. So you can imagine a set of circumstances where you have a history of being neglected by a parent or parents. And you kind of remember that feeling of being like kind of alone and not having that really important person. Then all of a sudden you're reading about someone who is also neglected and it triggers something in you. You're going to interact with the case or those materials in a different way than somebody who doesn't have that history. Are you someone who is highly empathetic? I considered myself during the years that I practiced, as someone who could meet my client right where they were, no matter what the set of circumstances were. I wanted to be there and be very present for my clients. But that came at a great personal cost to me in terms of like my stress response. Personal values conflicts. You're representing someone in a case where you're kind of like, oh, I really do not want to be representing a person who is alleged to have done whatever they are doing or who is taking a position that offends my sensibilities. And then what are you doing in terms of taking care of yourself? Do you have a very healthy practice of building in time for your own well-being? Or are you kind of across the board spread too thin, going from work to other responsibilities at home and really not having time for yourself? That's really going to make a difference in terms of how you perceive what is going on in these trauma cases. There are a number of professional risk factors as well. Number one, work overload. I'm guessing that the vast majority of people who are watching this are in some way maybe nodding your head or agreeing, like just the aggregate number of things that you have to do can amp up your stress response. If you're someone who has a lot of traumatic cases, let's say you are right now an immigration lawyer. So you have a lot of cases that are trauma-laden cases. And in addition to that, you're working in kind of a traumatic sort of setting right now where, kind of this idea of, advocating for someone who is seeking asylum is something that, is drawing the ire of opposing counsel in certain cases because of potential things that are going on kind of behind the scenes. Do you work in isolation? Again, something that can definitely put you at risk. I don't have it on here, but certainly your lack of control over your caseload can really be a significant professional risk factors. For most of us, we don't have a ton of control over the kinds of cases that we're working on. We take whatever is assigned to us and we work those cases. And that lack of control, that lack of sort of autonomy over your caseload can really increase your stress response. Whenever I talk to lawyers about stress response, I always talk about the adversarial system. So maybe somebody who's in-house somewhere isn't experiencing that adversarial system in the same way. They still have to please other people in terms of their work and have people who are questioning their work. But the adversarial system that we work in, if you are in any kind of litigation, is unique. In other words, you are working in a system in which someone is actively trying to work against you. And many times lawyers kind of forget about like how odd that really is. So I usually use an example of a physician. So you can imagine that a physician is entering an OR and is going to do a life-saving procedure on someone who's on a table anesthetized with, proper people there. But also in the room, you're trying to do surgery to save this person's life. And there's someone else in the room who is trying to actively stop you from doing that work. That is our adversarial system. It is a very difficult, very stressful way to work. And then do you have the resources that you need? Now, I know I went through all of these really difficult things about trauma cases, but I do want to reassure you that despite the fact that we have lots of trauma cases and we have high caseloads and we don't have autonomy, um, we can usually still handle the demands of the job. I can tell you that there were definitely hills and valleys in terms of my practice over the years, times where I handled them better than other times. Um, but we have to recognize that by virtue of working on these heavy trauma cases, or working with clients who have very significant histories of trauma and have a lot of needs, it's going to impact us. And we're going to talk about some resiliency strategies that might be able to help. There are many mental health concerns that can run secondary to untreated secondary traumatic stress, and that lawyers tend to experience in greater numbers than the general population. And so, this is what we usually think of as the mental health component of this particular program. So the first one we talk about is empathy distress fatigue. What is that? The more common name for it is compassion fatigue. And that's the exhaustion that we get when we are working in a helping capacity with someone who potentially has either a traumatic story or has a very significant emotional needs. And the exhaustion doesn't come from the work that we're doing. It's not coming from reviewing the discovery or writing motions that use trauma laden facts. It comes from actually the exhaustion of working with that person over and over and over again. And sometimes, like I would have clients who I would consider to be like high emotional need clients. And that's what I'm really talking about. So I'm talking about like what it takes from the professional, from the attorney, to attend to the needs of our clients who have these kinds of histories. For lawyers, I can tell you that it's exacerbated by the fact that we work in a closed system. Number one, we tend to deny the fact that, these cases really affect us, or that our clients affect us, or we have engage in gallows kind of humor about it. Um, and also, we work in a closed system. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that they have studied therapists who work with high trauma populations. And those therapists actually do better than the lawyers. And why is that? Number one, because we are not trained to handle our trauma, the trauma that we get from other people. Number two, we do live in that deny, defend sort of system. And number three, we work in a closed system. So we don't collaborate. We don't talk to each other like, oh, I have this really high trauma case. What have you done in the past when you've had a high trauma case like this? We don't talk about that. And we don't work collaboratively. We work alone. And because of that, we tend to suffer uniquely. So, what are the signs of compassion fatigue? And, for a number of these things that are coming up, I'm going to be putting different kinds of things that, you might be experiencing emotionally or you might see behaviorally for you that are kind of signs that maybe it's a good time to partner up with somebody and sort of kind of get to the bottom of what is going on. So when we're talking about compassion fatigue, the most common is feeling drained and overwhelmed. This is when your emotional tank is on E. You're like, your phone is ringing, it's a certain client, and you're like, I have got nothing left to give to that particular client. I'm so exhausted. I'll talk to them next week. If that happens repetitively, if you feel like you have nothing left to give your clients, you're having sleep problems, you're sitting down to do your work and you feel completely overwhelmed. Those are signs that, you might be suffering from compassion fatigue. And you'll see some of the other kind of characteristics here. Now, compassion fatigue is different from burnout. And I'm working on a burnout CLE right now. And part of what I'm exploring is like, how do lawyers get burned out? What can they do, long before they're burned out to put systems in place to prevent that from or delay it, strongly delay, sort of the onset of symptoms. But burnout is what in its most simple terms, is the I hate my job syndrome. It is when you're like completely done. So emotionally, you're exhausted. You got nothing left to give to anyone. It's really difficult for you to make yourself sit down and get your work done because you are depleted. It is completely understandable if you have burnout that you are not going to want to do your work because you've got no energy left to give to that work. Many times, what we see is cynicism about our work when we're feeling burned out. And that might be like questions like, oh, or statements like, oh, I'm just a cog in the machine. I really don't matter. That actually goes to that reduced personal feeling of accomplishment. Or, the court system is a joke. I'm just going through the motions, but I really don't make any difference. Those kinds of cynical attitudes towards your own job and the people or the system that you're working in, those are classic signs of burnout. Um, Many times, what we see with attorneys is that as a result of their job or the result of the cumulative stressors that they have, that depression becomes part of their lives. And so I really want to spend a few minutes here really talking about depression in the legal system, in part to kind of put it on your radar screen that we have, as legal professionals, we have abnormally high rates of depression. There's study after study that says, is there something about the practice of law that makes us depressed? Is it that people who tend to, work with these, troubling, difficult cases tend to get more depressed? There's all kinds of different things that have been studied. But at the end of the day, really what we have to know is that we're at far greater rates. We become depressed at far greater rates than the general population. The most recent study suggests that rate is 28% of practicing lawyers. That was an enormous multi-state study that was done. Smaller studies since then suggest that the rate of depression is holding steady right around that 28 to 30% of practicing lawyers have experienced or are experiencing depression. And not just like feeling blue or feeling down, but actually the things that we use to define clinical depression. Attorneys are number one in the nation in terms of the professionals that they study in different occupations. We have the highest incidence of depression. We replaced dentists a number of years ago, and we've sort of stayed in that position, but it's like lawyers, dentists, and physicians are some of the most depressed individuals. We have extraordinarily high rates of contemplation of suicide. And if you don't take anything else from the CLE except this, I want to put this on your radar screen. We have 11.5% of lawyers who have contemplated suicide during the course of their careers. This is a very difficult profession that we practice in, and it is taking its toll on our mental health. So what does depression look like? This is kind of a long list. And I'm just putting it out here so that you have some ideas of what you can be looking for. So the most common thing that you'll find is sort of an apathy, kind of checking out of life, withdrawing from normal relationships, losing interest in the kinds of things that you used to enjoy doing, becoming, very irritable or short-tempered. Absolutely, one of the most common signs that lawyers have reported is an impaired ability to concentrate. They sit down to do their work and they cannot make themselves do it. I've heard people talk about it in terms of like, it's as if they're in cement and it's drying around them. They just cannot get themselves to do the things that they want to do. For colleagues, what I would suggest you do is kind of like keep an eye on your colleagues. If you see like a big change in their behavior, all of a sudden they're shutting the door, they're withdrawing. If they're starting to talk, even you'll see speech changes. Sometimes somebody will talk more, as if it's more effortful. those are all signs that maybe they might be in trouble and really benefit from, talking to that person. You cannot go wrong by expressing a caring attitude towards someone who's depressed. One of the things that people ask is like, what kinds of things can I say to someone if I think, whoops, if I think they're depressed? And so I wrote out a list of different things that you can say, but really what I want to kind of impress upon you is that what you want to say to someone if you think that they're depressed is the same thing that you would say to anyone who you thought had some kind of a chronic illness. I'm there for you. Can I go with you to talk to someone? This happens to people. It's very common in the legal practice. Let's figure out what we can do, or talk to them about what resources are available. Tell them I'll make you dinner and I'll come over and hang out with you. But part of what we always want to make sure that we're doing whenever we're talking about mental health conditions are normalizing the conversation surrounding them, because the stigma is something that sometimes prevents people from getting help. And then again, always remember that, part of depression is going to keep that person from wanting to reach out for help, reach out and connect with someone. So it's okay for you to kind of check in with them on a regular basis and just say, hey, you know what, I'm thinking about you. Can I stop by for a little bit? And sort of trying to, make yourself, an ally to that person so they don't feel like they are suffering alone. The next thing we're going to talk about is anxiety. I'm going to talk about this really relatively briefly because we have a whole other CLE where I talk about anxiety at much greater length, which is I'm actually offering tomorrow. It's on perfectionism, because perfectionism and anxiety many times go hand in hand. So if you're interested in that, you can hop on the LCL website and sign up for that free CLE. But what do we see? We see rates of 19%. That was part of that same study that I was talking about earlier. 15,000 lawyers surveyed. This is what they were saying. Roughly 19% reported having severe anxiety symptoms. What do we know? Well, since 2016, we had the pandemic. That did not help anxiety levels at all. These rates are pre-pandemic. The smaller studies that have been done around the country in different states would suggest that anxiety levels have actually risen significantly post-pandemic and are closer to that 30% mark. So we all can kind of get an idea because we all have some symptoms of anxiety. It's adaptive to have some symptoms of anxiety. But when we're talking about this kind of anxiety, what are we talking about? That sense of, oh my gosh, dread or negative anticipation. It's many times associated with that Sunday night dread. There was a period of time when I could tell like my anxiety was really ramping up because on Sunday nights I'd feel like I had an anvil on my chest. Not a good sign, not a good sign, really a sign that you need to kind of rebalance. Again, potentially partner up with a therapist or LCL to kind of get it under control. Rumination, sort of that obsession with thinking about things either in the past, that's rumination, kind of running over and over and over them, or future casting, thinking about things in the future, and definitely being more irritable, snappy, having greater mood swings. Those are all signs that anxiety is maybe running a little bit amok in your life, and maybe it's a good time to think about doing something about it. It will come as a surprise to no one in the legal profession that we have issues with alcohol use disorder in the law. And so even if you just look at this graphic, you can get a pretty clear idea of, what is the role of alcohol in legal practice. So way down here, we have, the general population at 6%, have what is considered problematic drinking. There's some criteria that they use for that. Typically, you're thinking of someone who has hazardous and possible dependence on the use of alcohol. When we look at judges, we're at 9.5%. So, absolutely over the general population. But when we look at lawyers as a whole, what we see is 21%. And we have every reason to believe that number is, if it's not increasing right now, it is definitely holding steady right around 21%. And if you are a newer lawyer, you're under the age of 30, or you've practiced for less than 10 years, we see a lot of alcohol use in that population. So that's when we're at that 32%. So when we are at work, what are we looking for? Again, we're always looking for those changes in appearance or behavior. Someone who kind of overreacts if you ask them, questions about their alcohol use, becomes very defensive. People who tend to leave during the day or have a lot of unexcused or undescribed emergencies that come up and they have to leave. In the past, when I worked with people who had chemical use disorders, you would see them leave during the day and come back later in the day after a prolonged absence, and then work later in the day after having used their chemical of choice. So what do you do? The first thing we always want to do is educate support staff. I always think support staff are boots on the ground and they know what's going on. Support staff tends to really have a very good idea of what's going on in an office setting, but we want to make sure that we're offering non-threatening reporting options. So I can think back to different times in my life where I felt particularly vulnerable in my role, where I would be highly unlikely to report anything to anyone higher up because of concerns that it could blow back on me and adversely affect me, either in terms of the work that was being distributed to me or in terms of my actual job. Distribute LCL materials. We have tons of materials, and just make sure that those are available. And then start talking about substance use disorder and mental health. Just make that kind of a normal conversation that you have, because we are at greater risk. And there's nothing that we can do in terms of the profession as a whole being at greater risk, except we can do things about talking about it and educating people and offering lots of options. If you have someone, and this happens very frequently at LCL, where you have somebody who is in your office setting and you're not sure how to approach them, you can contact LCL for coaching. That's something that our caseworkers do. They have all kinds of different ways of brainstorming with you, with coming up with the best way to approach somebody if you have concerns about their alcohol use. And so what happens, this is kind of a profile of someone prior to recovery and after recovery. What they experienced, this attorney gave us permission to use this. And so, they said, I was functioning at a really high level, but I was miserable. I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I felt like a fraud. I had this constant sense of dread, constant sense of anxiety that somebody was going to confront me about my alcohol use. And afterward, what do they express? Personal and professional fulfillment. And relationships are getting better and more real, because of course, when we're using alcohol or any other kind of substance, it's going to be a barrier between us and other people. Confident and content. And because this person went through recovery, they now report that they're more capable of dealing with ups and downs, the ups and downs of life. So we have talked, sort of a little bit here and there about resiliency. So really, I want to spend the last part of our time together, this last 20 minutes or so, talking about resiliency, what it is, how you can get more of it in your life, some options. Some of them might resonate with you. Some of them you might be like, yes, that really speaks to me. And some of them might be like, nah, that's not really me. That's okay. This is not an all or nothing proposition. I'm going to throw a number of different things out there talking about resiliency, and maybe some of them will speak to you. If you want other ideas, you can always contact me directly at LCL. So resiliency defined, the definition that I really like is it refers to our ability to return to well-being after a setback or adverse events, or to maintain well-being amidst kind of the chaos or the difficulty that we experience, on a regular basis as attorneys. And the one thing that I would tell you is that I joined LCL last year. And because I'm a curious sort, I've spent a ton of time looking at, neuroplasticity in the brain. And I could tell you a lot about it, but let me just tell you this: resiliency can be learned. Very few of us, came bursting into this world with tons of strategies to be able to handle the kinds of stress that we experience on a regular basis. Some people do, but for most of us, myself included, we really had to work on a resiliency plan. Really had to think about what are some things that I can do that will improve my stress response. The first thing I always talk about when I talk about resiliency is the piggy bank analogy. Yes, I put a piggy bank on the screen, but I do that because I think it's the perfect analogy for resilience. And when I talk about that, what I want you to do is think about your limbic brain and think about the fact that during the course of your practice, there are going to be deposits and there are going to be withdrawals. So things that might be withdrawals to your ability, to your reserves, are things like a difficult conversation with opposing counsel, getting slammed with some kind of unexpected motion, being assigned a very big project with a short turnaround time. So withdrawal, withdrawal, withdrawal. And what we tend to not think about are like, what deposits should we make into this bank? Because otherwise that bank is going to be empty in no time. So before we talk about specific resiliency skills, we need to talk about how do we make space for practicing personal resilience skills. And that's really when boundaries come into place. And I am working on, as I said before, a CLE on burnout that has a focus on boundaries. That'll be rolling out in the next couple of months. But in the meantime, we're going to give you a very, very shortened, abbreviated version of why boundaries matter. So boundaries really define, the space or the relationship between you and something else. So when we're talking about personal boundaries, we're talking about somebody asking you whether you'll volunteer or whether you'll do something for somebody else. And professional boundaries, those come up all the time in terms of projects that we're working on. The one thing I want to make sure that you understand is it's okay to say no to something. In Minnesota, we are very agreeable, nice people. And I say this because I'm an agreeable, nice person, and I have said yes way too many times. Sometimes it's really difficult for us to say no. Or if we say no, we have to give a long, detailed explanation as to why we're saying no. I would, but, and then a long explanation. So my challenge for you in the week ahead is on one occasion, and it can be more than one, but on at least one occasion, when you're asked to do something and you really are saying, like, in your brain is screaming, no, 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 and you hear your mouth sort of saying yes, I want you to just say no. And don't offer any explanation. You can say something along the lines of, thank you so much for the invitation to blah, 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 but I can't do that right now. Ask again, ask sometime in the future, but right now, no. Why do we have boundaries? It protects our energy. It helps us. We all know, as you're sitting there, wherever you're sitting, in your office, at your home, at your counter, at your table, at your desk, if I asked you, tell me, how are you doing energy wise? You could do your own self assessment. You could tell me pretty accurately exactly how you're doing. I'm spread too thin. I feel overwhelmed. Or, hey, you know what? I've really been very aware of kind of boundaries and I'm putting a lot of things in place and I feel pretty good. So I'm always going to ask you to think about that. Like, we want to protect our energy. We want to protect our reserves. Having boundaries enhances well-beings, our overall well-being, because again, when we're protecting our reserves, we are leaving for ourselves all kinds of energy to do the kinds of things that we really want to do. So it reduces our stress level and it reduces kind of that resentment that we sometimes feel when we feel like, oh man, nobody does as much as I do. I'm doing all of these things. And why did I say yes? By saying no, we're not going to have that resentment towards ourselves or even towards somebody for asking us, but definitely towards ourselves that we said yes when we really wanted to say no. And for those of you who have children, Um, I believe that, setting boundaries and explaining to your kids what you're doing when you're setting a boundary, not as it relates to your child, but like, Aunt Joe asked me to do this and I said no. And the reason I said no is because I think it would be a really good event, but it would be depleting. Allows you to, kind of act out or work with your kids to teach them boundaries from a really early age. It's not something that is intuitive and it's not something that's taught in school. So boundaries are super important. So let's talk about some personal resiliency strategies. And these are strategies that you can employ to strengthen your capacity and improve your reserves. Of course, I would love to talk about workplace strategies. I would love to talk about what employers could do to give you better space, that you could be more resilient. But unfortunately, that's outside of the scope of what I can do in a CLE. So what I'm going to focus on are some things that you can do, some relatively simple, light lifting things that you can do on repeat that are going to improve your well-being. And we're going to start with basics. I know. Sometimes when I put this slide up, I always feel like people are like, no, not nutrition, sleep, and exercise. But yes, nutrition, sleep, and exercise. And hopefully, I'll be able to sell you on some of these ideas. The first thing that I want to talk about is nutrition, and that is paying attention to what you are putting into your body, how you are fueling your body. And we've talked about that historically in the context of, physical fitness and, physical well-being. I'm talking about something much broader than that. And I want to tell you about the tie between your gut bacteria and your brain. The recent studies show that 95% of serotonin, that's that mood stabilizer, that's that hormone that helps you with your well-being, is produced by your gut bacteria, right? And we know that stress suppresses beneficial gut bacteria. So we really have to make sure that what we're eating is fueling both our bodies, but also our brains. In addition to that, when we pay attention to our nutrition, when we're really kind of intentional and purposeful, we can have other benefits as well. This is what I call the taking a vitamin phenomenon. This is when you maybe go to your physician and you tell her, look, I really would like to do better, just overall in terms of my nutrition. What do you recommend? And she might lay out a number of different things. And she might also say, you know what? Why don't you just start with taking a vitamin? Does she think that the vitamin is going to make a material difference in your well-being? No, she does not. But what she knows is that that act of taking a vitamin every day can have a cascading effect. In other words, you start paying attention to the other things that you're doing. I took my vitamin this morning. I'm not going to negate that by eating this sugar encrusted donut. Now, you might eat the donut anyway. I'm not saying you're not. But what we know is that when we start taking steps towards our well being, they tend to multiply across time. I'm not going to talk about sleep for very long. I will tell you there is a thing called sleep hygiene, which is paying attention to the setting in which you are restoring your brain at night. And that means, obviously, we want to make a really nice, cozy nest to go to sleep in, so that our brain can, work through all of the things that happen during the day. And so we want to, have normal, regular bedtimes. We want to have cues. We want to have absolutely no electronics. I know, you've heard that before. We have LCL has an entire CLE on sleep. So I know an entire CLE. It was amazing when I saw it because there's so much that I learned about the importance of sleep. The last thing I'm going to talk about is exercise. And you can do small things to get a big benefit. Exercise of all kinds has been shown consistently over study after study after study to improve mood and lessen anxiety. We don't know exactly how that works, but we do know that people who have in the past experienced any kind of, depression, anxiety, that exercise helps it from coming back once you are feeling better. And it's also, again, it's one of those things that when we're intentional about it, it tends to have a cascading effect. When I talk about exercise, I'm talking about small steps. Now, many of you out there are probably already, out there, you're pounding the pavement, you're on the trails, you're riding your bikes, you're lifting weights. Bravo. That's wonderful. Keep doing that. But also don't underestimate the significance of a brisk walk, especially if you can team up with a friend to do it, so that you have both the exercise component and the connection component, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Okay, so strategies to increase your personal resilience. The first one is self-compassion. I ran into Dr. Neff's work a number of years ago, and it just really resonated with me. Like, what is she talking about when she's talking about self-compassion? You'll see in the materials that I've linked to a number of her different books. She's got books, she's got workbooks. But for Dr. Neff, self-compassion is something that she is 100% studied and is committed to. And it's comprised of three separate steps. The first is self-kindness. The second is common humanity. And the third is mindfulness. Self-kindness is nothing more than treating ourselves like a trusted friend. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemy. We can obsess over what we have not done correctly, or we can focus on things that are not very kind. So, what we do when we catch ourselves saying something that's unkind to ourselves or something that's super judgy, like I can be real judgy of myself sometimes, is we capture that moment and we say, wait, what do I really need to hear right now? So many times, what you need to hear is not really what you're saying to yourself. You might be like super judgy, but what you might really need to hear is like, it was an excellent attempt. It didn't go exactly like you tried, but you did it. Think about, she has a chair exercise that she does, but basically it's like, what would I say to a friend who was in these circumstances? Like if this friend just went to a motion hearing and said all kinds of things that they didn't intend to say and didn't say the things they intended to say, what would you say to that person? And say that to yourself. Common humanity is something that I rely on and lean into all the time. And common humanity is simply remembering that we as human beings have all suffered disappointment and failure. We are not unique in our suffering. In other words, sometimes I'll feel like, oh my gosh, nobody gets as nervous as I do in the 5 minutes before a CLE starts. And then I'm like, of course they do. Of course they feel like you do. Of course they worry about like they're not going to cover the right material or they're going to say something stupid. Of course they do. And what that does when I remember that is it knits me together with all of the other people who have had those common experiences. I do, and I meditate regularly, and we're going to talk about meditation in just a minute. But one of the meditations that I do is a connection meditation where you actually imagine all of the people who have had common experiences, that the ones that you've had, and how you're connected to each other. Mindfulness under Dr. Neff's theory is really just kind of noticing that you're having a difficult experience, whatever that might be, and turning towards it without judgment, but really turning towards it with curiosity, especially when we talked about like many of the things that we've talked about in terms of trauma are things that we turn away from, right? And we use some kinds of techniques that are not really necessarily very effective towards our stress response. But what Dr. Neff has us do is really turning towards it with curiosity and saying, like, why am I having this experience right now? And describing the emotion as you feel it and putting your hand on your heart or clasping your hands together. There's an actual reason you do that. It communicates to your brain the kindness that you will feel. Sometimes people say it feels really unnatural to respond like this, but I would just ask you whether it is natural to sort of beat yourself up. There is study after study, I'm not going to go through these, that show that people who have high levels of self-compassion actually do better in every single area of their life. They do better professionally, they do better personally, they have stronger relationships. Study after study after study, they get less sick. They tend to be more optimistic. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is mindfulness. Most of the time when people talk about mindfulness or think about mindfulness, what they are thinking about is meditation. It does not have to be meditation, but if you're interested in starting meditation, I put a link to a free app in the materials. So you can like start with meditation. And that app also has some really wonderful exercises that you can do. I meditate regularly. I have an app on my phone called the Calm app. That's a paid meditation. I really like that particular app, but there's all kinds of apps out there, free and otherwise. So, what do we do when we meditate? Really, what we're trying to do, or we're practicing mindfulness, it's 100% portable. You can take it with you wherever you go, but it really is sort of zeroing in on the place you are right now. I like meditation as a practice because somebody is telling me what I'm focusing on, my breath or the position of my body or the contact between my hand and the ground or whatever. I really like that. A gratitude practice is another way to practice mindfulness because, again, it keeps you from being in the future or the past when you're talking about what am I grateful for right now. And in my materials, I again put a link towards towards a gratitude practice and some gratitude prompts so that you have a number of different things that you can think about. The last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of resiliency strategies is the power of connection. We can be so isolated. We can forget about how important it is to connect with other people. Positive social relationships are a key factor in resilience. And the reason we know this is because scientists have actually just had people think about somebody that they feel very connected to, a family member, a friend, a loved one. And we know that it tamps down the stress response and ups the positive hormones in our bodies, even just recalling those relationships. So, usually, what I ask people to do, and I'm asking you to do it today, is when you click off of this CLE, I want you to just take out your phone and quick text somebody that you care about and just say, I was just in a CLE. This woman was talking about the power of connection, and you're the first person I thought of. So thank you for being my friend, my love, my husband, my wife, my partner, my uncle, whoever it is. Something else I tell my kids all this time, a burden shared will always feel lighter. When you have some heaviness in your life, being able to share that with someone else lightens the burden. Take really small steps. None of this requires Herculean effort. You can just take small steps, and each of those steps will reward you. And then consider the importance of soft connections. I'll be writing an article about soft or weak connections. And those are like the barista, the clerk, the people that you talk to on a regular basis, the person you see when you're walking your dog, and connect even when you don't feel like it, and maybe especially if you don't. Um, Again, celebrate those victories. As you start doing some of these practices, really pay attention to how you're feeling and praise yourself for taking those small steps over time. They will be cumulative. And this is my last, what I'm going to close with. So this is by the Dalai Lama. Fill yourself with good. Think not lightly of good, saying it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. And what I'm saying by that is little by little, those little steps. Likewise, the wise one gathering it little by little fills oneself with good. So I am, again, from Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. We are your lawyers assistance program in the state of Minnesota. We provide services for anyone with any problem that causes stress or distress. And we provide services to attorneys, to your staff, and to your immediate family members. And then, of course, to judges and law students as well. We can help. We are 100% completely confidential, and we are here for you and only you. We do use a counseling center called All One Health. You can get up to 4 free counseling sessions per issue. Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers pays for those services. And, per issue, if you're anything like me, you could easily come up with 5 or 6 issues to prolong that. You can call Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. Our phone is answered 24/7, either by us or by someone directly at All One Health. So again, my name is Sarah McGillis, Here's my contact information, my telephone, my email address. I am happy to entertain any questions or comments that you have at any time. Feel free to reach out. That's what I'm here for. So thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Sarah, so much. Appreciate all that information. I am looking to see if any of you all have any questions that you'd like to ask. You've got this great opportunity. I will do one more plug for Sarah's program tomorrow through LCL, Perfecting Without Perfectionism. I am going to be one of the attendees because it's something that I'm interested in and I want to support Sarah and her programs. And yeah, so I know we are at 1 o'clock, so I don't know if there are going to be any questions. We got to thank you. Yay, thank you. I do think the appreciations are good too.
I do. I
Um,
appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all for attending and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Sarah.
Yep. Bye.
All right, see ya.